Okay, so welcome. I'm Christine Wilkes and I'm going to be talking about measuring impact. I've got a colleague of mine who's going to ask some questions throughout called Harvey. Okay, good. So, let's have a look. So we're starting off with a picture of chaos theory, which hopefully won't represent, well, in fact why it is on there is because it will represent a little bit of the presentation. Hopefully it will calm down at the end. Close the door. Right, so this is what we're going to be trying to do. Do you want to have a look at that for a moment? Okay. So these are the areas that we're going to consider over the next 20 minutes or so. So we're going to be actually looking at some definitions of impact and outcomes. And we're also going to be looking at how we're going to actually try and capture some of that data that occurs along the learning journey. We've also will be thinking about how you actually measure and try and put a value on the impact. And then we'll think about practical ways of applying it and using it as tutors. And obviously it's all about focusing on that experience of your learners. So, what actually changes? Who changes? That's our question here. Who changes? How do they change? And how can we measure that change? And trying to, as I said, put a value on it. And one of the things that's very important that we need to think about is, would some of these changes have occurred anyway? So we need to continually think, what difference is our intervention making in the process? Okay, so you've got your boxer there thinking about impact. So you've got the impact of learning, and something on here we have to think about in terms of your outcomes. So putting a value on your outcomes, your intervention, and then taking away what would have happened anyway. So that's quite important that you consider that as part of the whole process. So continually think about what have you done to bring about this change. And on here we're thinking that impact isn't just about the learning outcomes, it's actually ascribing a value to what's happening. So thinking about the learning that's taken place and the other activities that have taken place. So they may not be pure learning, they may be other things like small changes in behaviour, understanding. You may not class those as pure learning. Okay. So this is I can't remember where we got this slide from. It's a slide that's actually distinguishing between where you start off. So you sort of got your inputs and then you've got your outputs. And this is very much what you agree within our service, what you're going to be achieving. And these are your measurables, your when you put together your service level agreement. But I'm thinking beyond here, and it's the outputs. It's actually what's coming out. So it's the outcomes, and the final point, which is the impact, which is actually the long-term, medium and long-term changes that occur. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Harvey? That's about the
only that impact is the higher level, overreaching effect that the teaching and learning experience has, and it can occur outside the classroom as well as inside.
Yeah.
So impact embraces everything that is happening as a result of the teaching and learning experience that you're delivering.
Good. Okay. Good. So thinking about who changes, you've got your ultimately we're aiming to change the learners. And it's a dynamic process, it's not a static process. You know, they're changing all the time, and sometimes they're going forward and sometimes you think, crikey, they're going backwards. But it's all part of change, it's all part of that change, it's not a linear process. You've also got changes in the tutors. So, you know, we also change because we're learning about the process of learning, we're learning about different cultures, about how all things fit together, the organisation, how you're learning about your teaching, has it been effective, or should I modify it? So it's a dynamic process, but also the organisation are changing, because you've got the whole cycle. So hopefully it will feed back into the process. Changes that you identify, they'll feed back in to improve your service. Okay, so I've got a lovely one here. So this slide, I've got to look at my notes because I can't remember this. This is from DFID, which is the Department for International Development, and it's quite a nice diagram which shows the flow again of the input, the process, things going through, and then you've also got the outputs, the measurables, and beyond that, and as Harvey said, the high level thinking in terms of the impact. This is from a document called Indicators of Input, Activities, Outputs, Outcomes and Impacts on Security and Justice, and that was in October 13. And it was an educational programme, but as I said, what's quite nice, you can do something like this within your organisation. Think about what you're trying to do, the actual process of that happens within there, what your outcomes will be, and then these two areas at the end in terms of measuring some of the expected outcomes, some of the unexpected outcomes, and finally that ripple effect of what happens beyond your project. Okay, so this slide's really illuminating the difference between outcomes, because outcomes are perhaps the chalk and impact perhaps is the cheese, but in fact they come together later on, because you start off with one and then it evolves, the whole process evolves. So outcomes are thinking of changes to people as a result of what you're doing in the classroom. We've thought about some broad areas where you can think about classifying what would you like to measure. So you may want to measure health and well-being. That could be physical health or mental health or both. Social relationships, very important, because social relationships are the sort of cornerstone of developing individuals. So those social relationships can move on to relationships with family, peers, later on relationships at work, and dealing with people. And that again, especially if you have learners that come from overseas, that's something that's really important, because learning how to develop those relationships and cultural imperatives are quite important. Also a big one for us in terms of employability, so we're hoping that people will develop skills that they can take into the workplace later on. Sometimes just bringing somebody closer to the labour market is a step forward, but volunteering as well is something that we're trying to promote and trying to encourage people so they can develop those skills in terms of interaction and volunteering with organisations, which later on can hopefully lead to full employment. And progression, so learning this kind of idea of lifelong learning, starting off with your programme as a stepping stone within that foundation tier, and then moving on to something larger. So outcome indicators, I've put this slide in. It's a checklist for you. So the idea is that you don't have to use all of these pointers, but it's something that I would recommend that you download and use as a checklist when you're starting to build your impact assessment, when you're starting to think about impact. Really think about, are you meeting the needs of all of these points? So I'm not going to spend any more time on this particular slide, but this is something for you to download and use as part of your development process. I've also put in a slide which are some sources of literature that you can use. Now, these ones in particular, they look like they're fairly old, or they're not that old, but they're not current. There are some more current documents, but these are specific documents that were designed for adult and community learning that are looking at measuring impact. So they were, you know, it's a specific exercise that was undertaken. Right, now this one's interesting. Well, let me just have a look at that for a moment. Think about what things are actually worth. So I found this quite interesting. In particular, social relationships. I thought that was quite a staggering total, £658 per measurement of better social relationships. But we had a discussion about this, and one of the points here is that it's the long-term impact that this has, and it's the saving to the long-term savings. So you perhaps don't have to get social services involved, the cost to the courts, the cost to NHS. So sometimes these better social relationships have a rippling effect. Anything you wanted to add to that, Harvey?
I think that reinforces the importance of impact as a holistic, overarching effect. Social relationships is a particularly good example of the added value and the benefit that can arise from the teaching and learning. And I think it's important to recognise that that may well be an unintended consequence. And in the class, for example, you may not even realise that your students and learners are acquiring these other benefits, such as, for example, improved study skills. And it is extremely important both to be aware of the added value that your teaching and learning is giving the students, and to be aware of these wider impacts, which can be very significant.
I mean, as I said, the cost to sort of dysfunctional relationships is quite significant, is very high. And at this point, let's have a look at the next slide, because that sort of, I was actually going to go on to this double loop learning. And one of the, this is by Chris Argis. He did some work with Donald Shon, and it's quite interesting because this idea of double loop learning, it definitely interfaces with the consequences of impact. And rather than just thinking about something, having a look at what's happened, maybe reviewing it, reflecting on it, and thinking, right, well, okay, well, yeah, I'll change that next time. This actually, the idea of double loop learning is where you really do get the impact occurring, where you reframe and reevaluate what's happened. And this is what we need to encourage our learners to do. Not just think about what's happening in the classroom, but how do they apply that knowledge out of the classroom? And when they come in, ask them, what did you use from last week's lesson? Think about it, so to get them to actually embed it in what they're doing. And that's where the whole double loop learning process occurs. Okay, so thinking about some of the unexpected outcomes, we are asking tutors for miracles as usual, and unfortunately it's not straightforward. I'd like to be able to give you a list and say these are all the points and just tick them all off, but it doesn't work like that. You have to look at each case on an individual basis and decide, is there any added value that's come out of this? And that's why later on you'll see that to actually find out what the unexpected is, you need to actually go and talk to your learners and find out what's come out of that learning that we've done. What have you gained from that? As Harvey was saying, we've got study skills, you've got social interaction, you've got things like attending on a regular basis, so you've got time management. When your learners turn up late, addressing that and challenging that sometimes, and thinking about getting students into that routine, expectations which they can carry forward into work. So rather than throwing away all of those wonderful benefits that happen in the classroom, and sometimes I talk to tutors and get this anecdotal information, and this marvellous thing happened, or they understood about another culture, or they learnt about what we do in the UK. Capture all of that information. So these are your unexpected benefits. These are some of them that are occurring. Okay, so data collection. These things are vital. So initial assessment, the very starting point, this is when you're thinking about what am I collecting? I'm having a snapshot of that learner. But I don't just want a snapshot of them learning about my subject. What about that individual learner? Are they confident? Do they need to develop their self-esteem? Are they quite reticent? Do they need to learn to speak amongst men and women and other cultures? So initial assessment is an opportunity to gather broad information about your subject, but much broader. Think about that group profile, so building a little profile of your group so that you actually pull together more information about the group, not just where the country that they're from, and information about how long they've lived in the UK. They may be part of the indigenous population, so they may have been born over here, but have they got family? What's important to them? What are their aspirations? So all of this can go into your group profile and give you rich data that you can then use to measure progress. Your individual learning plan, absolutely crucial. That's where you're talking about that individual, and that's how you can measure that journey. And other documents as well. I think some of these standard data, things like achievement, you can pick those things up from the register. But your learner voice is another document that you really want to harness and maximise. Find out what the learners have, not just what you've taught them and what they've learned, but what they've used beyond the classroom and what's made a difference to them. What things can they actually remember? So this is quite important. Any other comments on that slide, Harvey?
I would just like to emphasise the really critical importance of the initial assessment in terms of measuring impact, because it is the initial assessment that gives you your baseline and your starting point for your individual learner. And the more comprehensive and the more accurate you can make that initial assessment, the better your measurement process and the whole procedure and capture of impact data becomes far more effective. This in turn helps you as a tutor to target the learner with that particular attention and or teaching that learner may require. And I just wanted to emphasise that the initial assessment is not just an exercise, it is a critically important document and something that will help you throughout that learner's progress.
Good. One of the problems that does occur is that at the beginning, initial assessment is undertaken during the first week or the second week, and usually it's front loaded, so it's right at the beginning of a course, and this is when you've got all of these other things to collate and undertake in terms of enrolment and all of the other, outlining your programme. You've got your induction, you've got to cover all your safeguarding. So sometimes initial assessment is, almost people steam through initial assessment, but as Harvey said, it's an opportunity to capture a lot more than just about one particular subject. And I just want to mention a colleague of mine, Louise, she teaches maths, and she was referring to the fact that a lot of her learners, English is their second language, and one of the difficulties we have is with the actual the way that the questions in the exams are written. It actually becomes quite problematic. So you do need a certain level of English. So she needs to consider that when she's recruiting learners for her programme. So that, as I said, it's just that it isn't one subject. It's usually quite a holistic approach. You have to think about that learner as a whole person. Right, I'm going to go on now very quickly to a particular document that you're going to need to download, which is an impact assessment document that has been put together. Now the impact assessment document, as I said, you'll be downloading that and you're going to need to refer to that. It's developed from something that ELSIS put together, and it's optional, so you don't have to use this. You can design your own if you've got something that's more appropriate. But I would recommend that you use this, because quite a lot of time has been and thought has gone into actually adapting this to fit what we're trying to do at Harrow ACFL. So we're thinking about the outcomes, but we're also thinking about change. We're thinking about change and evidencing that change, and it gives you an opportunity to think about those areas that we thought about in terms of health, social relationships, and some of those wider and unplanned outcomes as well. So download your impact assessment, and we're not going to do an activity for this particular presentation, but it is available for you to use, so I would recommend that you have a look at that. Okay. Learner voice. I've mentioned the learner voice, and we also at Harrow ACFL have some set questions that we ask. So we have a sort of generic questions that we ask. They're beyond questions that you find on your standard evaluation, so they try and drill down a lot more to try and actually find out the difference that the course has made. And we also look at measuring things like British values with some of our classes, so things like ESOL classes, that will be something that we also integrate. There are some standard questions that are available for you, and this is really important when you do this collection process. Ideally it shouldn't be your tutor, because the tutor, if you ask me, was your presentation any good, you're not going to, well, you might do if you're honest, but you might not want to say, no, didn't really think much of it. I think the learners need it needs to be impartial. The learners need to actually be able to say, it was good, but you know, they're adults, they have an opinion. So actually collecting that whole methodology is quite important, and we've got some guidance on collecting the learner voice. So this is one really important way to collect information that can distill into finding out what impact, what difference your classes have made. It's a little bit more here on the learner voice, capturing it, the core questions, the format of questions, how you use that. It could be forums, it could be focus groups, it could be individual case studies. So you may just want to look at one learner and their journey, you may want to look at a forum, you may want some open questions, you may want things to remain anonymous so that people can speak quite freely. So there's some more information, as I said, on our website about that. Right, okay, now I'm conscious that we've only got about another 5 minutes. So this is an area, social return on investment. We don't have that much time to really spend on the remaining slides, because this in itself is a whole presentation, and there will be a further presentation looking at the social return on investment and looking at the value of some of this. So I think that will be coming later on. But all I can say at this stage is that the social aspect, the concept of measuring what the return on your investment, you're running a class, what are you getting back in terms of how much you've paid out? This is a process of you calculating, but it's the social aspect, and that is part of impact. Harvey, anything to add to that slide, or shall I?
No, thank you. I think social return on investment is such a large
huge,
subject on itself.
Huge.
But I do think it's important that tutors are aware both that the subject exists and also it is a means of quantifying some of the wider benefits that we've been talking about. It is worth actually making one or two inquiries, perhaps having a look on the internet on social return on investment, because it does help to focus attention on the improvement in soft skills and the social changes that can result from good quality teaching and learning that is delivered in the classroom. The results of the teaching spread far wider and further than simply the learning outcomes for the particular lesson.
And that's that ripple effect. So I'll put the link on at the end for you on the social return on investment, because as I said, it's such a huge area that within the scope of what we're doing, we won't be able to cover that in any depth. But it is an integral part of what's looking at impact. Okay, so we're thinking about how you can actually use the idea of chalk and cheese coming together, the outcomes, the impact, You can feed them into your quality improvement documents, your quips. Thinking about when you do your annual self-assessment, that process is vital. So thinking about capturing that, and that information can feed into that. This is an area of increasing importance, the pound plus. You know, how are you costing what you're doing, and how are you making sure that your contribution, the value of your contribution, so that could be volunteering. So, you know, thinking about integrating that into your pound plus strategy, and you know, just feeding it all back into the whole cycle.
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
It can also be very, very important to help when you're dealing, for example, with Ofsted, or looking at the matrix or something.
Don't mention Ofsted. Yeah.
This can be very valuable evidence about the quality of the teaching and learning that's being delivering, and it's easy to throw away nuggets of gold by either ignoring these factors or not worrying about impact. Impact can give you information and data that can help you show and demonstrate when the crunch time comes that you are giving a quality service, and that deserves to be recognised. And I don't want tutors to miss out on these opportunities to show concretely quite how well they're doing.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, within the classroom, I think that it's very easy to get lost in what have we got to achieve, what's the lesson plan, but this is all the added value that's happening. And when I